Hello, everyone. Welcome to Arash's World. Today we have not one, but two very special guests here on our show. How are you guys doing? Jan and Jillian Yuhas. How are you doing?
We're doing great. Thanks for having us.
Oh, for sure. So I'd like to start off you presenting yourself in briefly to our audience. What is something that you talk about? What would you say here? How would you briefly introduce yourself?
I would say we are relationship and boundary experts, and we focus on resolving conflict in relationships, whether personally or professionally.
Okay, yeah, that's wonderful. And so, your book is Boundary Badass, a powerful method for elevating your value and relationships. So are you gonna teach us to be boundary badasses?
Yeah, that's the goal.
Yeah, definitely. We can get into that for sure.
And I like how on your website you talk about this book not just being here a self-help book, but also here a self-empowerment book as well as a self-discovery. And those are two terms that are loaded, that are very important, I think. And it's not just about the work life. It's also, as you said earlier, introduce yourself, relationships that we have. And relationships can be in different forms and formats. However, it all depends on us and the value we give to ourselves. And as somebody who is recovering perfectionist, I realized that perfectionism did a lot of harm because it is actually not really appreciating your own value. So I want to jump into that and about the difficulty of finding that balance in work and life, and then take it from there. So what would you say is one of the main problems? Why do we have issues with setting boundaries, for instance?
I think a lot of times it goes back to our childhood experiences and whether our voice was either heard or dismissed. And a lot of times too, we can grow up in situations where our voice is heard, but then we might move to a larger city, or you might experience different changes that we're not comfortable with. And so a lot of times it can be very hard to voice our value, or a lot of times we just don't have the shared values with people we get involved with. And so then we're like, how do I navigate these types of conversations or interactions when I'm not being heard or respected? But then at the same time, I think what people struggle with is the fear of other people's responses and not knowing how to say it in a way that bridges the gap between two different perspectives, but then also allows us to actually maintain that relationship.
100%. I agree 100%. And I think it's really because we felt at home often our voice was not valued, was not heard. And then we kind of transfer that without knowledge, like unconsciously, we transfer that to the work environment where we say, well, we often take abuse because we say, well, maybe I deserve it in a sense. And I think that is very dangerous and harmful to the individual.
Yeah, I think that goes back to, understanding our limiting beliefs and how can we change some of our shortcomings and apply them and create them into our biggest strengths and go through that self-discovery process, which allows us to feel empowered, knowing that our voice could actually create change for the better.
Mm-hmm. And but there's often a lot of abusive relationships in work, and there is a lot of things that goes unnoticed too. So there's also conflict, and sometimes I found also people who are in charge are not very good with dealing with conflicts, and there are different ways. They either ignore it, oh, it will work out, or they engage in it, but again, not in a biased way and not in an objective or fair way often.
Yeah, often those who are in like a CEO position or management position, sometimes they have what we call psychological blind spots, and they are unaware that they might have these avoidant tendencies to shove things under the rug or ignore it if it's not a major priority. Avoidance is also can be seen as people pleasing, so they don't want to disrupt the status quo, or they don't want to cause greater conflict within the workplace culture. So they might avoid or see things as very minute, but that can sometimes start to breed and start to fester, and it becomes almost like a volcano, and eventually it's just going to erupt everywhere if we're not really addressing things as they're coming up.
Yeah, and one thing is there's often a company a culture going on, and so when you enter, for example, a new job, you have to figure out what the culture is, and sometimes it's actually not very good. And so there, as someone who likes to fix things, sometimes things get worse, and so on. So in their view, right? So how can we adapt to the culture or would you say should we just speak up and try to change it? And how do we negotiate with that ourselves with the conflict that might exist there?
I think we have to explore what's already in place and what's
Yeah.
working, and then also understand what may not be working, and then present new innovative ideas that would allow us to open up those communication channels and negotiate what are new strategies that we or policies we need to put into place in order to support a better, healthy work environment that people can thrive in. Because at the same time, we don't want to overstep on things that are already working that may be in place, but every voice does matter in a work culture. And so I think being able to present new ideas is definitely shows that the employees are valuable as well as executives, and really trying to bridge those gaps and pull everyone as the collective.
I think also when you create an atmosphere of integrity and have foundations based in valuable and principles, so the company's values, if they have 5 values that they operate by, then those values need to be really honored across the dynamics within the workplace culture, such as integrity, trust, communication. And so when we hone in on our values in creating functional ways or systems of operation, it really allows things to be much more smooth and creates a culture of respect.
Mhm. Often it's so top down, when you have the management and they make the decisions, and often they don't hear it again, depending on what we're looking at. But so that's slowly changing. I feel like, especially now with the advent also of remote work and so on. So things are kind of becoming more democratic, if you like, and so their voice is heard, and this is also talked about. Like and you talking about these issues is very important so that we can level there and we can negotiate. And especially like just maybe 10 years ago, it was impossible to change anything. But now I feel that there's this chance to open up the dialogue without fear or retribution and so on. Is that a correct view of mine?
I do think employees nowadays are much more outspoken in terms of advocating for themselves or their needs, and in terms of achieving that work-life balance lifestyle within the workplace. Or they have no problem asking, whether they deserve to have a salary raise if they're doing multiple roles. A lot of times that we see people are getting bombarded with multiple roles or responsibilities outside of what they were actually hired for. And so I do think that people are starting to recognize their worth more, which is a good thing. It's just a matter of the approach in terms of, because I think we've kind of gotten into like a me mindset society, but when we're trying to resolve things, we need to have a we mindset. So the approach is very important in terms of executing our value and how we're going to voice that with upper management in order to seek a win-win outcome.
Exactly. And so, what about remote work? How is that? I mean, there are lots of opportunities there, but there's also challenges. And so, how do we negotiate from the point of view of the CEO, because you have access to that, as well as from the point of view of the employees? How can we find that work-life balance with including here with the challenges, also benefits of remote work? What would you say? How has that changed the dynamics?
I think a lot of times remote work has been much more beneficial for employees because they're able to find more of that work-life balance. And especially if they were having to travel to their job, that can take anywhere, from 30 minutes to an hour, sometimes 2 hours out of their day. And so people are definitely having more time for self-care and self-love, which can really manage some of those work-life stressors that they may experience throughout the workday. And this really allows them to navigate and find more of that balance. And I think too, it's a lot of times people can find it easier to communicate
Mhm.
in a virtual world than in a
That is
face-to-face
true.
person.
Mhm.
And so being able to really pay attention to people's body language and their tone of voice, their expressions. I think a lot of times people can feel safer to express in the comfort of their own home versus in an office setting that can be very corporate-y, stiff, or, uninviting at times. So I think the work life from home balance, remote work has definitely been a big benefit to a lot of companies.
Mhm. Yeah, the benefit of also leaving a meeting if you're feeling uncomfortable is very easy remotely. You just click a button and you leave, and you can say, "Oh, I had technical issues," right? But you can also be muted, which I think in real life is it's harder for them to do. But if they don't like your point of view, you can get muted. So that's a challenge there too, and I think that's important though. I think with anything, we need to find that kind of balance and look at both sides. I mean, it's not all good or all bad, and especially here, but there are lots of benefits there that we can draw upon. I think that's important too.
Yes, there are lots of benefits to the work-life balance and having more time for yourself when you are able to have some flexibility or even do a hybrid sort of situation and work from home. Um, Ideally, we would want to make sure we show up to, required meetings and not leave them because our integrity within ourselves is just as important in terms of how we show up in regards to our role and our integrity within the company because we are a reflection of ourselves in regards to how we represent our behaviors.
Also, too, I think it's important for businesses to establish meeting boundaries and what that looks like and set the tone and guidelines prior to having those meetings where, like, if one person's always doing all the talking and another person feels like they never get their chance to speak, how can they balance that in a way that each person still has the opportunity to share innovative ideas and you don't have to feel like someone's always like the center of attention or stealing the show or trying to be the one that runs everything, where each person does get a chance. And so having those guidelines and boundaries put into place prior to business meetings can really be effective, and it prevents greater conflict or wasting time where a meeting could be 15 minutes versus an hour long.
Yeah, efficiency. That's really important too. How do you guys feel about a 4-day work week? And I think I personally support that, and I think because it's shown in studies too that productivity increases, motivation, and so on, and that helps with self-care too. Because sometimes I've seen people on Fridays in offices and they're not doing much, right? So I would say if they had the day off, they can come up with more energy and more productivity. Do you agree with that? Is that something to look at?
Yeah, there are certain countries implementing that 4-day work week now. And I think if companies or employees are able to sustain productivity within that 4 days rather than the 5 day, then I think it allows more work-life balance for people. So as long as productivity is still sustained within that and people are motivated to that they only have 4 days to get everything done rather than dragging it out or procrastinating, which can be a self-sabotaging habit, then it can benefit the balance and the mental well-being of their employees.
I strongly believe in the holistic view that everything is comes together and fits together. So I would like to have people, especially in management or in higher positions, who are balanced themselves. And it's kind of interesting though, but sometimes it's not the case, and you feel that there's a persona coming on. So I would be friends with my bosses, and we're talking before a meeting, we're chatting and so on, and suddenly like the meeting starts and it's a completely different person, and it's just like a switch that kind of goes on and off. But I think it's really important to have the balance. So if again, being kind of an authentic person throughout your life, and just like the different parts, so you can't just really separate one from the other. And I like how you talked about here, you're talking about relationships, because what you have at work is also reflected at what goes on at home, etc. So there's this like all these forces that come into play. And so if we work on ourselves, we can be better employees and bosses and so on in the office. So I think that's important. It's not just work skills to develop. I think it's really about personal and interpersonal skills that we need to look at more.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I think too, the whole goal is, create everybody to become a great leader. Whether just despite your role, whether you're an employee, an executive, or a boss, like everyone should have those leadership skills, which helps that company evolve and grow collectively. And I think that allows everyone to also maintain self-respect and mutual respect across all relationships.
But there's often the empathy part is lacking, I find, when you're looking at numbers or productivity only, and it's like the drive. And so that I think needs to be fostered a bit more. And again, in my view.
Um, I really don't mix emotion in business, so I would approach it more from having a understanding or compassionate way of listening to and being an active listener and being that everybody gets a chance to be heard and understood is the primary goal when it comes to business. So if everybody has a chance to share their perspective, then we can find that common ground and reach a resolution that allows everybody to effectively move forward. Obviously, everybody is human and we want to treat everybody with respect. But the bottom line of a company is to usually generate revenue in order to make sure they can sustain the salaries of all their employees. And it's not to say that we don't want to treat our employees like a number. We do want to make sure that they are valued and heard and understood. And it is a balance of making sure productivity happens, but everybody is valued too.
Exactly, and that leads to more. I think that sometimes it's just a slight modification of one's approach can bring that about. I think that's important. And yeah, sorry.
Yeah. When employees feel valued, they're more likely to want to give and be much more productive in the workforce.
And it's been shown that studies that it's not just about money. I mean, it's like not just increasing the pay, but if just maybe sometimes attention, you give them attention and they work harder. And so attention does not cost anything to the company. So why not do that? Sometimes I'm wondering about that.
Yeah, recognition can go a
Mhm.
long way in just acknowledging someone's, hard work and their efforts that they're putting into that. And I think a lot of times having those, small check-ins every now and then, which with employees can be really effective because they feel like that they're a part of the organization and they're not just like she said a number, but they're being felt as if they value, they
Yeah.
matter to how
Yeah.
the company actually is effective. So I think sometimes just the simple recognition, acknowledgement can go a long way in terms of someone's effort of wanting to continue to be part of that company.
Yeah, we're trying to create a greater collective that everybody is a community within that, corporation or company. Because at the end of the day, if you lose your best talent, then the foundation starts to chip away in regards to that company. So it's really important to make sure everybody feels that they have a place, that they are valued and recognized.
Exactly. Yes. And what's the ASAP method, the ASAP method? What would you say? What does that include?
Yeah, our boundary method is the ASAP method. And when it comes to setting boundaries, we want to do it as soon as possible. And so the first A stands for assess with discovery questions. So if there's a disconnect in the relationship and we're not understanding each other's perspectives or the actions that occurred, then we need to assess and gather greater insight to where that person is coming from, because this helps us eliminate greater understanding between maybe opposing perspectives or an adverse behavior that we experienced.
It can also really, by asking discovery questions, it can really drop people's defense mechanisms because
Mhm.
it shows that you're trying to stay outside of that power struggle and just gain further insight.
Yeah, and you're trying to understand them. That's where that compassionate piece comes in, is we're trying to understand them so they feel heard and understood. And then next, in the second step is set a boundary. When it comes to setting boundaries, we want to stay outside of the person and we want to address the behavior. So, and we want to say, it seems like maybe we're not on the same page when it comes to response times. I really value communication. What do you think would be an appropriate time for us to respond back to each other in order to make sure we're on time and completing this project? So we are creating that negotiation process of a response time. Maybe it's like we need to respond to each other within 2 hours or 2 days. It can vary depending on the relationship, but we're creating that consistency and we're creating transparency and clarity within the relationship of how we are meeting the productivity with regards to communications and staying on top of things. And then the next step is A, we're going to agree to a mutual plan. And P is proceed forward with integrity or accountability within that agreed upon boundary that we negotiated.
And I can see that work in different places, not just even at the workplace, but also in relationships that we have.
Oh
Oh yeah,
yes, this is for family romantic. It's the
Huh.
entire book covers all different types
Yes.
of relationships, friendship, partners, parents, children.
it's definitely the method is very relationship intelligence driven and it's a universal method that can be applied to every type of relationship we have.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it goes back to setting boundaries. And I again like that, being a boundary badass, because it's something that I've struggled with. Because when you try to please others or you don't want to displease them, I think that's more it. And it's like in a relationship too, in a personal romantic relationship. So that is also important to find that sweet spot, the balance between the two. But how would we deal with conflict then in that situation, especially if you talk about romantic relationships? What can we do? What's the best way? Is it again following the ASAP method or?
Correct. Yes, it is. But you might say instead of it appears or it seems, we could say I think or I feel we're not understanding each other when it comes to communication. I value open communication. How can we find a way to respect one another and respond within, and if 3 hours of time frame or something like that during the workday, or maybe it's in the evening, whatever that looks like based on that, couple's relationship or friendship. And I think a lot of times you're just trying to bridge two perspectives together without attacking their character. You're just addressing the behavior, the problem, and you're really just trying to say, how are we going to do this? So you're putting it back on them to come up with a solution. It gives them the opportunity. And a lot of people love to talk about themselves. So when you give them the opportunity to talk first, it allows you then to position a solution too that could create a win-win outcome by taking what it is that they say and positioning it to find that middle ground.
Yeah, because often when you have romantic relationships, especially if you have someone that it kind of boils down to attachment style. So for communication, if you have somebody who's more of an anxious attachment style, they might want to communicate with their partner all day long, where you have somebody else who might be a little bit more on the avoidant attachment style. And so what happens is if they don't want to communicate all day long and they're like, I'll just talk to you later when I see you after work, what happens is that becomes triggering for the anxious partner if they haven't healed their unresolved wounds. And then the avoidant partner also might get annoyed with the anxious partner for wanting to communicate all day long. And so what they're doing is triggering each other's unresolved wounds because they haven't, resolved it and healed. But if they can find that balance of what works for them in regards to communication, then they can find a plan of action that works for them in regards to how they're going to stay in contact with each other with finding that balance.
But the goal is for each person to have a voice in that decision-making process. Because if you set an ultimatum, which is a one-sided demand, and say, you better respond to me within 3 hours, of this email or text message, that creates more conflict. And that's only a one-sided projection being displaced onto the relationship because it's only from one person. So the reason why we need to really come from that we mindset and open up the communication channels, because that allows both people to have a voice, which it's more likely to be respected if there's a mutual agreement.
And that goes back to the teamwork mentality too, and
Yeah.
within the family. And I have that with my son too. It's like we listen to each other, we talk. It doesn't mean that he calls the shots and makes the decisions, but that his view is valued as well. And it's something that's been lacking in my own life. So that's again, we try to consciously integrate that, and I think that is very important. So again, making again every voice, as you're saying, everyone feel valued within that community, because that is a kind of community as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so what are things? These are things we should be doing often, but what are things we should not be doing? And I like to look a little bit about that too. What are some no-nos? Would you say in again, whether it's at the workplace or in personal relationships? And I think we touch upon some of those things, but what are some things that you like to like specifically focus on? Some negative traits that we bring into the dynamics often.
I think a lot of times, if we don't have self-awareness, that's where we start projecting our own cognitive biases or psychological blind spots onto the relationships. And so what happens is that we might bleed onto people who didn't originally make the cut in our deeper childhood wounds that we have that haven't been resolved. And so we need to have a lot of self-awareness in order to make sure, and that's our power, is to have self-awareness, because the more we have self-awareness, the easier it is for us to navigate anything externally outside of us.
I think too, another thing is a lot of people tend to use emotion when it does come to expressing themselves. And while emotion is super healthy for us to understand and have, at the same time, if we use emotion to try to resolve conflict, it actually only escalates the conflict, where often the time our tone of voice and our choice of words can really actually diminish the conflict and allow us to advocate in a way from a place of value. And as we mentioned, values are universally understood, where emotions are one side perspective. So not using emotion can be super effective.
Mm-hmm. And there is the self-care aspect is important, but also I would say maybe something self-tending of trying kind of licking your wounds, if you like, of taking time off to reflect on things. I think that's really important. And instead of often we jump to conclusions or we'll blame others, and just kind of stopping and like being like really honest with ourselves. Where are some of my flaws too? And how can I find a compromise? And often people don't like to have compromises because they feel they lose out or it's against them and so on. And I think that that's not the case if it's, again, carefully balanced.
Yeah, I think a lot of people too, when they feel powerless, can also resort to manipulation tactics such as
Oh,
blame shifting,
yeah,
gaslighting,
yeah.
um, just more or less anything that they can do to avoid accountability, responsibility, because they're feeling out of control emotionally. So they try to control through other people. And so I think a lot of times going back to having that self-regulation and knowing how to manage our emotions can be also key to being effective communicators. So making sure we're not using tactics maybe that you may have experienced with a partner or, toxic boss, whoever that you've been involved with, where you experience some of those negative traits and not just carrying them out into your own relationships.
Mhm, mhm. And we do see
Yeah.
sometimes, sorry, yeah.
Our emotional triggers are actually key components to really understanding ourselves, because the opposite of our emotional trigger that we need met is a value that we're going to use when it comes to the boundary formula. So, for example, if we're emotionally triggered by somebody who is dismissing us or ignoring us or disrespecting us, the opposite of disrespect would we need to set a boundary on mutual respect. Or the opposite of being ignored, if that's triggering to us, we need to ask for communication, and because that's the need that we need met. And so the value becomes the place that we operate from to meet our emotional needs on a deeper level.
Mhm.
And also it shows that we're confident when we speak up using our I statements and saying, I need this, I value this, because that shows that you're communicating from where it is that you need versus telling someone what they have to do, which never goes because nobody likes to be told what to do.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so the triggers are really helpful. And I think instead of like responding immediately to it, but reacting, I'd say just take a moment and take a look at it. I find it often interesting. It's like, oh, why did I get triggered by this? There's nothing there, right? But once we look deeper, we find the reason. And it's a learning opportunity, I think. And so we should cherish them. It's not something to avoid. It's just like look deeper into it, but again, not react, as you're saying, just emotional. Like the emotional response would be probably the worst thing to do in such situations.
Correct. Yeah, I think a lot of times when people get triggered, they tend to react and respond right away, which doesn't benefit them because they tend to end up saying something else that they have to later apologize for, or
Mhm,
they'll just
mhm, yeah.
completely, throw it under the rug and completely ignore it. But at the same time, even stonewalling though is a sign of a reaction. So ignoring and not responding at all is also another reaction. So we
Mhm,
need to find that balance and just remember, I'll tell people draft a response, but don't send it till you're ready to send it. If you need time to step away and reread it, a few times, that way you feel confident about what you're sending and think about if I was to receive this message, how would I perceive it? How would I want to, engage with it?
mhm. And to be centered, I find when I'm centered and grounded, I react much better and much calmer and more patient to the situation instead of thinking like, oh, this is a personal attack or it's something that's meant to be personally. But no, it's kind of that kind of like calmness. And with conflict, I found it works quite a bit. When the other person is angry and you don't respond to that, then their anger dissipates or decreases in that situation.
Definitely, definitely. When you don't model their behavior, they start then to model your behavior because they realize they can't get a reaction out of you.
Because they expect something too. When people are angry, they expect a response. But when you stop, then you break that chain. I think that's the power we have ourselves. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, how did you come up with this, getting into this field of your conflict and boundary strategies? What led you into that? Is that personal experiences, studies, or what? Yeah.
We have a bit of a personal and professional story. So we grew up in a rural town of 900, moved to a metropolitan city of 3 million, which was a huge culture shock for us.
Mhm.
And we were used to being heard and understood back home by our parents or living in our small town. But when we got to a metropolitan city, that really left us without the skills to be heard and understood. And we experienced a lot of individuals or relationships, friendships, and romantic where we weren't in alignment with the same values that we were raised with. And so that personal experience kind of opened up our eyes, which kind of started our professional journey. We volunteered at a crisis hotline for 3 years and mediated between teens and parents. The teens had ran away from home, and that kind of sparked our interest into mediation. And we went on to get our master's in marriage and family psychology.
Okay.
And then we kind of started our businesses and we developed our boundary formula in running our first entrepreneurial business. And that led us to kind of where we are today.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's amazing. And I think it's really important to bring that kind of mentality too, if you like, small town into the big city and really like reaping the benefits of that. Because I think in a bigger city, that's often lacking, and that's definitely true. And but we can create small like bits and small pieces there, so to connect people with each other. I think that's hugely important too. Thank you so much for being at Rash's World. So we have here Jan and Jillian, or Jillian and Jan Yuhas. You are conflict and boundary strategists, authors, and your book is Boundary Badass, a powerful method for elevating your value and relationships. Thank you so much for being here on Rash's World. It's such a pleasure talking to you.
Yes,
Yes,
thanks
thanks
for
for
having
having
us.
us.